You read that right. Tell, not told. I want them to blow this house and everything in it into oblivion. The cops tried to help. They're all gone now. I've barricaded myself in the bedroom closet. I don't want to go out like this, but I don't think I've got much of a choice. I'm holed up in Marathon County, Wisconsin. The thing outside, no. I've got to start from the start. If I don't, you won't believe me. You'll think that it's a prank. Listen, you need to understand both the truth and seriousness of what I'm about to tell you. My time left on this earth is now measured in blows the closet door can take before it shatters. You've got days at best before this spreads out of rural Wisconsin and into major population centers. How long you have after that depends on how close you are to Wisconsin. It all started with the dead deer. Jeremy spotted it. We had been on our post-church hike, taken in the early, warm fall oranges and the browns of the Mead Wildlife Reserve. All four of us often remarked how lucky we were to have such a deep, thick forest right on our back porch. If we had known this would be the last time that we would ramble through the red oaks and the basewoods, I would have made more of a point to stop and smell the crisp air, to take time to pause and enjoy the contrast between the sun's warmth on my face and the cool winter breeze still awakening in the shade. Sarah and Harriet were sharing quiet whispers about the pastor's wife and the marital implications of the neckline of her new dress. My brother and I walked a ways ahead, not saying much but occasionally pointing out good potential spots for the next buckshoot season. That's when he saw the doe, kicking and braying some 30 yards off the path. We could hear it before seeing it when we drew closer. Deer, whether doe or buck, made one of the worst noises you could think of when they get themselves in a trap and don't have the common sense to lay down and die when an arrow or a slug gets them in an artery. That's why Jeremy and I both used to say the two most important tools against animal cruelty were a steady shot and good cardio. The only downside of living near the mead was waking up in the night because one of the whining creatures had found its way to your porch. Another half-dead victim of overweight tourism hunters from the city. Lousy shots who will clip a fawn in the neck and then chug back a beer while the poor beast drags itself away through the brush to die alone and in agony. I understand why people hate hunting. I'd hate hunting too if I had learned everything about it from some sicko banker thrill killer that only pulls the trigger because it gets the blood flowing in ways that his wife can't anymore. But yeah, that's not why I'm here. It's also plumb stupid to waste time on getting you to respect a forest that I want you to napalm out of existence. Now there's more than one thing folk could say about the ladies Jeremy and I took for wives which we couldn't get too mad about. Yes, my sister-in-law Harriet was an incorrigible gossip, and my Sarah had mastered the art of asking one too many times when she wanted to get under my skin. However, they were both Wisconsin girls through and through. That's why when we came to the twitching thing with rolling eyes and spittle-lined maw, it was Harriet that spoke first. Stay back, Jer, it's rabid. Look at its legs. Must have taken a tumble down a cliff. None of us disagreed. The proud beast's whines and howls were tinted with a ragged edge everybody that has grown up around animals would recognize. The browns and whites of its fur were matted with dirt in some patches, thin and almost skin bare in others. Its breast hung quick and shallow from its ribs, and the superfluous joints above its front hooves put the wretched thing in a new, unnatural pose with every kick or spasm. Sweet Mary Mother of, we gotta put it out of its misery. Sarah had crouched down next to it, close enough to inspect proper but not so close that we would be spending the afternoon getting her shots. Do you have your gun, Jer? She asked, not turning from the panting creature. My brother shook his head. No, I left it back at home. Not this season, same as Kyle, I'm sure. "Bet you think getting a gun rack for the truck don't seem so stupid a notion now, huh?" I grinned down at Sarah. She didn't turn around, but I knew my woman well enough to hear her smirking and rolling her eyes. "Kyle, give me your coat," she said, reaching an arm around her back and snapping her fingers in my general direction. "Why?" I said, unzipping the thick rainproof jacket and stepping towards them. "Because I don't want to get bit, idiot. Jeremy Fisher, sometimes I swear your mama gave you all the brains to spite me with the gift of a handsome idiot." The rest of us laughed while Sarah wrapped the thick material around her arms, putting the coat on backwards and using the excess fabric left by our notable size difference to cover her hands. "Now listen, you city folk reading this. I know you may find us laughing in this situation callous. I know that if you're not of the soil, if you've grown up safe in steel and concrete, the idea of laying hands on one of God's creations to end its suffering puts a lump in your throat and salt in your eyes. Things are different out here. Jeremy and I were 7 when Paul had to snap the neck of a buck my brother had caught through the snout with a .308. Sarah had skinned and chopped every deer and rabbit that I would bring home. Plus, we had all once seen Harriet decapitate a raccoon with a shovel when it broke in to have her Thanksgiving spread one year. So yeah, we weren't what you would call perturbed by the harsh organic snap that cut through the background of chattering, creaking branches and hidden woodland life. We did take the time to stand for a moment in silence out of respect. It wasn't a conscious thing either. It's just what you did. Sarah stood, head bowed, not taking her hands out of the coat that she had wrapped around the beast's neck when she had snapped it. "You did good, Sarah Fisher." I placed a hand on her shoulder and giving it a brief squeeze. I felt her tension abate a little, her shoulders unsquaring themselves and her breath uncatching, just enough for her to speak. "I know, but gosh darn it, that doesn't make it any easier. Not how I wanted to spend my Sunday afternoon," she sighed, pulling her right arm out of the coat. I'm still surprised that, of all of us, it was Jeremy who had screamed. He's not usually one to get squeamish at the sight of blood, you understand. Sarah stood, staring at her own right hand, mouth flapping open and shut like a fish out of water. Her wrist, thumb and palm were covered in slick scarlet. The red wetness poured freely from a deep gash, running palm-side from pointer to pinky. "Sarah!" I could see the color draining and I knew what was coming. I lunged forward just in time to catch her before she fell. You can imagine how the afternoon played out. Me carrying Sarah back to the truck, stitches and shots at the ER, a hefty bill that almost makes me angry at her instead of the circumstances. You know, the usual. You done got bit by a critter treatment. I threw the coat out, ashamed too it was a good coat. I inspected it before throwing it out, of course. The inside of the left sleeve, that she had been wearing it backwards, remember, was stained dark red. The doc reckoned that a sharp piece of exposed bone must have got through the fabric when Sarah had snapped its neck. I ate up that explanation at the time because, why wouldn't I? Still, even then, I thought it was odd that I couldn't find any notable tear or rip in the coat. The seams looked a bit warped around the armpit, but that was it. I decided to ignore it. Big mistake, as I'm sure you can guess now. Sarah came to around the time that we pulled up to the hospital. The doc wasn't all too concerned, put her passing out down to shock. No rabies, which was the main worry, at least at the time. For the next few weeks too, I thought the little incident would go down as nothing more than an anecdote to be brought up when the 4 of us were gray and bound to porch rocking chairs. The only thing that changed in those interim weeks was that Sarah insisted on avoiding our Sunday hikes. Being a supportive husband, I decided to also forego our weekly ventures into the forest. Harriet and Jeremy understood. Once or twice they had joined us for the new after-church pancakes and bacon tradition that we had started. Like me, they assumed the incident had rattled Sarah more than she let on, and that in a few months, she would be back and ready to go enjoy nature again. I would watch her ravenously inhale plate loads of stacked bacon syrup and 1 or 2 pancakes. My heart filled with nothing but love and sympathy for my woman, and the new fragility I falsely believed she had been taken by. All of that changed the night that it showed up. Harriet and Jeremy were at ours for the evening. The Brewers had taken a hard loss to the Dodgers, so Jeremy and I were already several beers deeper than we usually would have been. For those of you that can't read between the lines, we were drunk off our butts. I wanted to point that out. It's important to me that I'm not remembered as the kind of guy who would act this way sober. Harriet had spotted it. Sarah hadn't been feeling too well. She had come up from folding laundry in the basement earlier that afternoon, pale and complaining of a migraine, and had spent the day in bed. That meant Harriet took care of the cooking. Now please don't think this is to do with any kind of sexism on the part of my brother and me. As I said, they were Wisconsin girls through and through. Harriet was never the one to pass up a chance to show off her skill with a pot and some bratwurst. We were drowning our hopes for the season when we heard the plates smash. The shriek alone would have been loud enough. Harriet was stood at the sink, smashed china around her ankles, usually rosy-faced the shade of Bible paper. She was pointing with a trembling hand at something standing in the yard a few feet away from the porch. I squinted, trying to make out what I could in throwaway light from the kitchen window. After a few seconds of shoving my face through the inebriated beer fog, I realized that I had recognized it. It was a deer. No, not a deer. The deer. The same one that we had left dead in a thicket nearly 2 months before. That alone wasn't why Harriet shrieked, however. I could tell by the sight of the beast had knocked the pigment from her cheeks, long before I had mustered up the mental fortitude to link the events unfolding to my booze-soaked memories. Harriet was screaming and backing away from the kitchen, because the last time that we had seen that deer, it had been dead. It still was. It stood there, staring at us from the lawn, its head swayed and loud on its still broken neck, glassy eyes staring at us upside down, horizontal pupils dull and milk-stained. Jeremy and I were already heading for the door, shovel and a fire poker in hand, when it had started howling. If we weren't so drunk, I think we would have turned straight back into the house. The noise was ungodly. The bleats of a doe in pain turn your stomach the first time that you hear them, but this was far, far worse. As it was, we were men and we were drunk, so we did what drunk men do in situations like this. We beat the dang thing until it stopped moving. I must have brought the shovel down on it 7 dozen times. At least, I thought. The mangy mess of threadbare fur and exposed ligaments kept twitching and letting out that twisted whine no matter how much bright orange ichor splashed across my face and jeans. Finally, after what felt like hours of uninterrupted smacks of metal on flesh, what remained of the thing's frothing, flopping face faltered into gargling hissing and then silence. You should never drive drunk, and I know that. We were too shaken up by whatever the heck had just happened, though. We threw that thing into the back of Jeremy's truck without saying a word to Harriet. The sheriff wasn't too happy about it. You blasted Fisher boys coming in here stinking of booze like it's 2003 again. But he blanched when he saw the bloated carcass that we carried by the hooves between us. This isn't one of those stories where the police are foolish. Sheriff Harworst had gone to school with our dad. They knew that we weren't the folk to make something up like this. And to cut a long story short, he locked the thing in the morgue and said that he would give us a call once the local vet had taken a look. Because in his words, no dang deer should goddamn look like that deer, dang it. He knew that deer, no matter how posthumous, shouldn't leak fluorescent orange pus. He knew that an animal obviously many weeks dead shouldn't still be twitching, especially with no head. He knew that maggots aren't big enough to account for the writhing lumps below the belly of the skin. And above all, he knew that, out of the thousands of deer he had seen skinned in his close to 65 years, none had scales waiting once you peel back the fur. He also looked past us, driving home inebriated because, and I quote, "You boys have had enough grief tonight. What can I say, things are different out here." Harriet wasn't there when we returned. Sarah was sitting on the sofa, a little less blanched than she had been. She told Jeremy that Harriet had called a cab and headed home. This wasn't unreasonable. We had been gone for more than a few hours by that point. Jeremy said his goodbyes and then headed back. Sarah and I made love and then we both fell asleep. If I had known that night was the precipice of the sharp decline my world would soon take, I don't think I would have slept. The phone call from the sheriff explaining the deer that refused to die never came. The next few months were defined, for our town as well as I, with the search for Harriet. She hadn't been home when Jeremy had returned. The cab company remembered taking the call from Sarah on Harriet's behalf, but the driver had waited around outside the house for about 20 minutes and, after no response came from Harriet's phone, had assumed that it was a prank call. The sheriff, Jeremy, and I and the rest of the town had combed the forest. We never found a trace. Sarah had seen Harriet leave in a cab, but no license plate existed matching the one that she gave. Every avenue of inquiry came back empty, and as the weeks went on, Jeremy spiraled deeper and deeper into a futile depression. The irony of the fact that Harriet's body was right there in the house for all those long months isn't lost on me, even now when I'm maybe only seconds away from the same fate. Still, for the longest time, we believe there was a predator on the loose, the normal human type of predator, the paranoid worry that the next Dahmer or Wayne Gacy was in our midst, and it's what led to me putting the extra bolts on the door and bars on the windows. I thought that it would help Sarah sleep a little sounder. Being the caring husband that I am, I thought her newfound insomnia was caused by mental disturbance. I can't express how much I wish that were the case. Sarah's behavior became ever more erratic with every week that had passed. I assumed it was grief over the disappearances of her best friend and sister-in-law. Wouldn't you have done? It started with small things. First with her insisting that I didn't go into the basement when she was doing laundry. She even went to the extent of getting locks. She told me that she needed some more space, somewhere she could guarantee not having to feel another pair of eyes on her. Obviously, I thought this was odd, but it also sounded to me exactly like the kind of incomprehensible but valid request somebody carrying intense trauma would make. I respected her request up until last night. And the other signs were things that I don't think she knew that I noticed. I would come home from work to find her staring out the kitchen window, hands submerged in a sink full of piping hot water even though there were no dishes. She would spend longer and longer down in the basement. When it got to the point that after a few months I had to ask what she was doing, she got aggressive and hurled every name under the sun at me. She had only been that angry at me once before, when I had cheated when we were 17 at the time, a long, long while ago. We made love less and less. Eventually, she stopped going to church too. As the months rolled on, I got to the point of insisting that she go and see a counselor or a shrink or somebody. We had been talking about having kids before Harriet was taken. I couldn't bring up Kyle and Sarah Jr. alone, I told her, trying to feign a smile. That conversation was when I first noticed the changes in Sarah weren't only emotional. She had made a habit of scratching her temples. There was a rash, sure, but now I was this close to her and she was out of the basement. I noticed something strange about it. Small silvery flakes fell from between her fingers as she scratched. I had grown up fishing in lakes. I knew fish scales when I saw them. Her eyes were different too, off. She couldn't seem to focus on me as we were talking. Her gaze kept drifting, and sometimes I could have sworn the eyes were headed in different directions. Her features were puffy and blotchy. They had been for a while, but I had put it down to crying, but up close, that explanation didn't seem to cut it. Her lips seemed too loose when she spoke, her cheeks moving and sliding across her jaw like wet burlap over a sack full of hungry rats. Sarah insisted that she was feeling fine and that I was only imagining things, but I called BS. I should have phoned the doc or the police then, but I didn't. I phoned Jeremy. My younger brother was over in a heartbeat. He had already lost the most important woman in his own life. He dang well wasn't going to see his brother lose the most important person in theirs. When I told Sarah that Jeremy was on his way, she had first tried to distract me by initiating lovemaking for the first time in months. I pushed her off of me, repulsed. Now this may seem harsh, but if you could have smelt the stench that came from her mouth, you would have thought that my reaction was restrained. It was unimaginably foul, like decaying meat left to cook on asphalt at high noon. By the time that Jeremy had crashed through the doors, he found us engaged in a screaming match. This was an unfamiliar sight for him in itself. Sarah and I weren't that type of couple. I was too soft-spoken and she was too forgiving of my foibles. What was of greater concern to him, however, was the state of the shrieking thing that was Sarah, who stood hurling the worst kind of things at him from the open basement door. "Oh, screw you, Jeremy Fisher," she spat, eyes now fully locked on opposing ends of the room. "I bet that girl Harriet has run off to find a man with a bigger piece. You Fisher boys are both the same." And so on. I don't want to write it out anymore, even though the closet door is starting to shatter, even though I've seen what Sarah did and what she's become. I can't betray her memory like that. That wasn't her speaking, it couldn't have been. My Sarah would never. She didn't have that kind of venom in her, and I know she didn't. I can't blame Jeremy for losing control. Before I could stop him, he had lunged forward, his fist connecting with the side of Sarah's head. Teeth scattered across the floor. Far more teeth than a healthy adult gum should relinquish after what was, to Jeremy's credit, a pulled punch. The right hook that had knocked Sarah a step or two into the basement, hiding her from my view behind Jeremy. I heard him scream. Not the kind of angry scream that I'd have expected, or the remorseful horror of a man who lost temper had caused catastrophe. It was the scream of a child, a helpless scream, the scream of somebody whose sanity has been bent and snapped in one fluid movement. I was stood too far away from the basement door to reach it in time. Jeremy was pulled into the dark, a rake-thin hand with only a bore of passing resemblance to my Sarah, grabbing his shirt so tightly, blooms of scarlet formed in the material from broken skin beneath. I only caught a glimpse of what had made him scream like that, before the door had slammed shut, and the bolts behind the thick wood had clicked into place. I had seen a flash of Sarah's face. It hadn't snapped back into place after Jeremy's punch. The skin hung loosely, ear above her nose, eyes smashed into her right temple, nose and mouth bent and broken around the cheek, and where her other ear previously sat. The skin had torn around her forehead, and through the hole an eye locked on mine. Not one of Sarah's eyes, which now sat useless and crushed where her forehead once gave way to shining hair. A flat surface, dark orange save for a single jet black pupil. I didn't waste any time. I loved Sarah, but Jeremy was my brother. Any concern or confusion about what was happening to her took second place to getting Jeremy the heck out of that basement. Just as Sarah and Harriet were Wisconsin girls, we were Wisconsin guys. I did what any Wisconsin guy would do. I got my gun. The basement was quiet by the time the ringing from the gunshots had died down. With the army of locks on the other side of the door, It took a few attempts to get them all and for the thick wood to swing open. My knuckles were tight around the Winchester's trigger and I descended into the dark. The first thing that hit me was the smell. God, how had I not noticed it when I sat up in the living room? It was an acrid ammonia smell, a smell so sharp that it leaves singed nostrils and stinging lungs. I didn't have too long to think about the smell though. Kyle. I jumped the last couple of stairs, and if I had landed just a few feet to the right when I had slipped over, I would have dang near broken my neck. The floor was covered in a thick, tarry substance. I knew straight away that this was the source of the smell. With my non-trigger hand, I pulled my shirt above my nose as I stood. I didn't have to look around long to see where Jeremy had been calling from. The light from the open door at the top of the stairwell cast a slim beam of illumination across the back wall of the basement. Enough of a shadow to see two bodies glued in place with a hardened version of the same foul-smelling ooze pooling around my feet. One of the bodies was moving. Jeremy. Oh my God, Jeremy. I had to prop myself up with the butt of my rifle to steady myself as I waded across the room. The hardened ichor didn't budge or crack no matter how hard I pulled or hit it. Crap, Jeremy, it's not coming off. It's not coming off. Jeremy coughed and spluttered. Even in the dim light, I could tell that he wasn't doing good. He hadn't been down there long, but his skin had already flushed a gut-draining shade of purplish yellow. Every pore leaked sweat, and a gaping wound below his left nipple secreted greenish-white pus. The worst part, though, was his stomach. It was wriggling, heaving, pulsating in a way that just wasn't natural. I don't know much about anatomy, but I know people don't have muscles or organs that can stick out in the places that Jeremy's belly was. I remember when Ma was pregnant with him, when his little feeding arms would push and poke out of her bulge. He's eager to meet the world, Mom would say to me. I didn't want to know what manner of eager thing Jeremy carried, especially since I could see the state of the second body, and didn't have to stretch my imagination far at all to work out who they were and how they had died. It was Harriet. At least it had been Harriet. Even through the decomposition, I recognized her auburn hair, her narrow cheekbones. I also recognized the gaping hole where her stomach had once been. I recognized the hundreds of scratch marks around the open wound, and could see clearly in my head that whatever unspeakable horror had left them would soon do the same to my brother unless I acted quickly. I couldn't act quickly enough. I'm glad that I don't have long left to live in some respects, because if by some miracle I had managed to reach old age, that scream would never have left my nightmares. Jeremy started heaving and shaking violently. Jeremy, what's happening, bro? Jeremy, please. I babbled incessantly, as I kept trying to pull him free of the foul wax holding him to the wall. That was when I made the stupid mistake of dropping my gun. He let out a final, ear-splitting howl, and then all of the worst things in my life happened at the same time. Jeremy exploded. I don't have any other word for it. The force had actually knocked me back onto my butt. The unnatural belly, writhing, reached a crescendo and the skin split. A mess of churned organs and writhing, worm-like things blasted me from my suddenly quiet brother. I was trying not to puke, desperately brushing the quivering claw-headed larva off me, when I looked up at the ceiling, straight into a pair of flat, amber eyes. Sarah shivered, shaking the last vestiges of her former shell from her new, scaled body. I couldn't make out too many details before my view was obscured. In the shadowed ceiling, I had just enough time to catch how tall she had become, how disproportionate. I had a few seconds to glimpse her gray, slimy scaled skin still writhing and contorting as Sarah finally embraced the final stages of her transformation. Everything went black. I yelled, flailing to get my wife's discarded skin off me. It still smelled like her all over the first time. The scent of that lavender perfume turned my stomach. I couldn't get the mass of human leather off of me fast enough. The skeletal amphibious creature dropped from the ceiling. Landing on top of me, Sarah pinned on my wrist. I could do nothing but scream in protest, as the mandibles that now stood where her beautiful lips had been unfurled. A long, dark purple appendage uncurled from the recesses of her new face. I could do nothing as she plunged it down my throat. I coughed and gagged from the feeling of it slithering its way down my esophagus, past my stomach and into my intestines. My face was wet with tears. I struggled for breath, choking, unable to resist as it, made a disgusting, wrenching noise. With each of its undulating spasms, a lump emerged from her throat, traveling down the purple tube. I could feel each of them forced through my body by Sarah's new appendage. A white-hot pain flared from my guts. My bowels recoiled from the deep scratching, a burning sensation as whatever she was placing inside me latched onto the lining of my lower gastrointestinal tract. The withdrawal of the probe was almost as bad as the insemination from it. There was no part of my core that didn't feel on fire. I was also all too aware of a heaviness in my gut, a new alien weight that was already starting to move and flutter. The knock on the door saved my life. "Hello, Kyle Fisher, it's me, Sheriff Harworst. I went to check in on your brother, but he's not about. Is everything okay with you boys? We ain't seen you at church in a fair while." The thing looked up, startled by the interruption. I seized my opportunity, planting 2 feet in its distorted belly. It howled, releasing its grip on my wrist. I've never sprung to my feet so fast in my life. "Run!" I yelled as loud as I could in the direction of the sheriff's voice. "For the love of God, man, run now!" I ran up the stairs from the basement. I didn't have time to scream any more instructions, but I heard the sirens of his car blare into life by the time that I had reached the ground floor landing. I could hear Sarah scuttling along the wall behind me. I had to try and keep the mental image of her new thin, raking limbs from my mind as I threw myself up the stairs to the second floor. Especially since with every panicked step, I could feel the tightness and knots in my gut moving independently of my muscles. Any thought that she would remember, that Sarah might have spared me from the worst of what she's become, they were gone. I could hear her behind me as I staggered up the stairs. I was sure my heart would crack through my ribs. Each breath felt like my lungs were filled with glass, but still, I didn't look back. The doors and windows weren't an option, I knew that. Curse my paranoia. The bars that were supposed to keep the worst of humanity out now had me caged with something far worse than humanity ever could be. Fire ran up my gut with each heavy thud of my feet in the floorboards. I could feel something in my intestine. It was writhing, pulsing. No, not something, some things. The thought of Jeremy crossed my mind again. Please, I thought, please let help arrive before I end up like him. Sarah had almost reached me by the time I fell through the bedroom door. I could smell the acrid ammonia stench of the mucus that she had lined the walls of the basement with. I felt one of her crustacean-like limbs brush my ankle. I launched myself over the bed, landing in a heap of the other side from which I didn't bother to get up from. I spasmed towards the doorway in a panicked crawl, whimpering all the while. I managed one quick glance over my shoulder before I pulled myself into the open closet. The thing was that Sarah stood in the bedroom doorway, illuminated fully by the torch that I had dropped during my clumsy vault over the bed. My Sarah had been petite, barely over 5 feet tall. Now she had to hunch as she shoved and barged through into the room, splintering the wooden doorframe and cracking plaster as our house adjusted to accommodate her new form. Her old human limbs fell limp by her side. Her new appendages were many. Starting from her cracked and open ribs, a sea of bony, segmented legs ran along her anaconda spine. This new body slithered down and out of sight into the hallway. What little flesh remained on the monstrous centipede hung around its neck like a scarf, clearly ready to be shed as the rest of her skin had been moments before. The same could be said of her organs. Heart, lungs, liver, all hung shriveled and decaying from those clicking limbs closest to its face. And oh, that face. If I had had enough of a future to have more nightmares, that face would be the subject of all of them. There wasn't any of my Sarah left in the face of this thing. Her face, her beautiful face. It had been pushed aside by the elongated bones now protruding from where her nose once was. Her stretched, conical maw ended in a pair of sharp mandibles, razor-edged insectoid pincers made from the two halves of her once human jaws. Her eyes are what haunted me, what pushed the last remaining shreds of yesterday's breakfast from my stomach. They were still there but flat, lifeless, and ready to be shaken loose. Pushed aside as Sarah's old face made way for her new head. The sockets that once held dazzling blue orbs were splayed to either side of her, for lack of a better term, face. The new flat orange plates stared off in different directions, one on each side of her head, like the most hideous of deep-sea monstrosities. I must have screamed, but it didn't register. I know that she screamed at me, a horrible, guttural, piercing screech. A sound made by some manner of thing that is both insectoid and aquatic, and yet at the same time neither. Luckily, my fight-or-flight responses kicked in before I found what that sanity-rendering cry meant. I think I knew, though. I barricaded the closet door behind me. Not much available, but in my panic state, I didn't care. An old box of vinyls and the vacuum cleaner would have to do. Besides, even if I had something sturdier to bar the door, it wouldn't matter at this point. I had been on borrowed time since we had found the deer in the woods. I backed away as far into the wall opposite as I could manage. My face wet with something. Blood or tears, I didn't know, probably both. The pain in my gut is unignorable. I kept picturing Jeremy in my head, his contorted face twisting, his 1,000-yard stare at his stomach. No, I can't think about it. Even if that is what's going to happen to me, I'm not spending my last moments contemplating my hellish fate. That's why I'm writing this out instead. The last few days have been a nightmare, but I know they're a picnic compared to what's about to come. Unless I'm lucky. If I'm lucky, this post will reach the right people, and I'll die in a fiery inferno long before my children eat their way out of my stomach. She, no it, is scratching on the closet door. The sound of its mandibles scraping at the cheap wood is deafening. Not long now. I can hear its moaning chitter. The writhing things in my gut can hear it too. They quiver and twist with each cicada sound, eager and impatient to be with their mother. The sheriff has come back with the cops. They arrived about a half an hour ago. I haven't heard any sound from them since their screaming has stopped. This is it, it's only me, here at the end with the monster that was my soulmate. If you're reading this, don't send help. Who knows how many other things have been turned into one of these grotesques. One of these abhorrences, these sins against all that is holy. Something must have turned the deer that took my wife from me. Who knows how many of these things are out there, or how many more of them the thing that was my Sarah has spawned already. There's only one thing you can do. Drop a bomb in this house and nuke me, her, and the rest of this nightmare out of existence. Wipe us off the map before it's too late. Oh no, she's nearly through the door. Don't come here. Tell the army to put the Marathon County in quarantine immediately. If they don't, this thing will spread. We don't have time to do the normal arguing about ethics or morals. The only solution is to kill it with fire. Your lives depend on it. My address where you need to drop the bomb to save humanity is